On the morning of June 4, 2015, the quiet of Manipur's Chandel district was shattered. A convoy of the Indian Army's Dogra Regiment was making a routine journey back to base when it hit an improvised explosive device. Within seconds, a volley of rocket-propelled grenades and heavy gunfire tore through the transport trucks, leaving 18 Indian soldiers dead. The attackers belonged to the NSCN-K and KYKL, separatist militant groups operating in the region. After the ambush, the insurgents immediately crossed the border, disappearing into the dense jungles of neighboring Myanmar. To understand why they retreated there, look at this map of the India-Myanmar border. For decades, this densely forested boundary acted as a one-way door. Insurgents could slip back and forth with near impunity, exploiting the rough terrain to avoid Indian security forces. As you can see by these red nodes, heavily armed base camps sprouted up just miles past the line. The militants operated under the assumption that international borders acted as a legal shield. They believed the Indian military would not cross into a sovereign nation to retaliate. Standard procedure dictated that India would issue diplomatic condemnations and tighten border patrols. But issuing letters while attackers slept safely across an imaginary line was only inviting further attacks. A kinetic, physical response was required to break the cycle. In New Delhi, Prime Minister Narendra Modi convened a high-level emergency meeting. He made his expectations clear, demanding direct accountability for the 18 soldiers lost. National Security Advisor Ajit Doval presented a stark tactical reality. If India treated the border as an absolute barrier, the militant groups would continue to use Myanmar as a staging ground. The only option was to cross the boundary and hit the insurgents in their own camps. Using fighter jets to bomb the camps was ruled out because the militant bases were deeply embedded within local Burmese villages. Instead, Army Chief General Delbir Singh Suhag offered a precise alternative. Give him 3 days, and his forces would organize a covert ground strike. This single meeting erased a long-standing rule of engagement. The Indian military was shifting from a posture of territorial defense to extraterritorial offense. The mission, codenamed Operation Sunrise, was handed to a strike force of 64 Para-Special Forces commandos, led by an officer operating under the call sign Oscar Delta. To maintain secrecy, the team avoided the loud auditory signature of helicopters, opting to deploy to the border hidden inside standard Army transport trucks. Jungle warfare dictates specific equipment. The commandos relied heavily on the Tavor TAR-21 assault rifle, a compact weapon built for reliability in tight, humid, and heavily vegetated environments. But rifles alone cannot destroy fortified infrastructure. To ensure the destruction of the enemy camps, the unit carried Carl Gustaf 84mm recoilless rifles, shoulder-fired weapons capable of vaporizing wooden structures and bunkers. Since the entire infiltration and assault would take place under a thick canopy at night, the commandos equipped themselves with advanced thermal imagers and night vision goggles to pierce the darkness. By combining specialized rifles, heavy explosive launchers, and thermal optics, these 64 operators became a self-contained, lethal unit adapted specifically to dominate hostile terrain. On foot, each commando carried nearly 35 kilograms of gear. They navigated 40 kilometers of steep inclines and dense brush in the dark, pushing their physical endurance to the limit. Suddenly, the local guides signaled them to stop. Emerging from the brush were 5 armed Burmese hunters. It was an immediate tactical dilemma: execute the hunters to guarantee the secrecy of the mission, or let them go and risk them alerting the militants. Oscar Delta refused to spill innocent blood. He ordered his men to take the hunters hostage and bring them along for the remainder of the trek. It slowed their pace and added logistical drag, but it kept the mission ethically intact. But the delays cost them. Miles away from the target, the unit completely ran out of drinking water. Exhausted and carrying heavy loads in the thick June humidity, the team was forced to push through, with Delta promising his men they would drink the enemy's water once they took the camp. Special operations units prove their worth when they absorb friction, hostages, exhaustion, dehydration, and still maintain absolute discipline. The operators finally reached their mountain vantage point overlooking 3 militant camps. Scanning the perimeter through thermal optics, they watched the insurgents moving through the dark below. The original plan called for a 3-pronged assault, but the militants were drunkenly firing their weapons into the air on patrol. Realizing the enemy was awake and armed, Oscar Delta instantly adapted, splitting his men into 2 focused squads to consolidate their covering fire. At exactly 5 a.m., the strike began. 2 Carl Gustaf rockets tore through the canopy and slammed directly into the sentry posts. The lookouts were vaporized before they could sound an alarm. This data illustrates the density of the ensuing assault. Over the next 45 minutes, 40 automatic weapons laid down a continuous wall of lead. The Indian operators fired roughly 15,000 rounds and threw 150 grenades into the camps. When the smoke cleared, 2 camps were reduced to ash and a third was heavily damaged. More than 50 militants were dead. On the Indian side, not a single commando suffered so much as a scratch. Before beginning the long hike back to Indian soil, Oscar Delta untied the 5 Burmese hunters. He reached into his own pocket, handed each of them 5,000 rupees in cash, and simply let them walk away. By 3 p.m., the exhausted operators crossed the border back into the first Indian village. They bought out a local shop's supply of beer, finally hydrating after days in the brush, before Army aviation helicopters touched down to extract them. Back at headquarters, a satellite phone beeped. Lieutenant General Bipin Rawat picked it up to hear the radio transmission he had been waiting for. Mission accomplished. The commandos had cleared the jungle, but the mission's geopolitical fallout was only starting to spread. Within hours, the Indian government broke with diplomatic tradition by convening a press conference to openly announce the strike. They stood before the media and declared that their forces had crossed into Myanmar to execute the militants. In global statecraft, nations traditionally hide or deny covert operations to avoid diplomatic blowback. Publicly taking credit for a cross-border strike was a calculated display of aggression. Operation Sunrise demonstrated that the border was no longer a sanctuary. By combining surgical tactical capabilities with political will, India proved it would trace its attackers wherever they hid and eliminate them.